Okay, I'm also creating this on the same day, Sunday the 14th of April, but I'm going to be spreading them out a bit, giving people a chance to sort of absorb each video before the next one comes out. So this will probably be sent out a couple of days after the last one. So that last one I just did will be sent out tomorrow on Monday. And then this one will probably be sent out a day or two or three later, and so on. That episode, the last one was, or part 4, was on the genetic engineering of Adam, and it came from chapter 2 of Mauro Bellino's book, entitled The Book That Will Forever Change Our Ideas About the Bible. And now we're on chapter 3, the giants from Genesis 6. But it's going to cover a lot more than just Genesis 6. However, I'm going to spend most of my time on that, and then spend a little less time probably with some of the other texts. But I'm going to try to at least point them out, so that if you want to look them up yourself, you can. And just any observations he makes that should be highlighted, that are significant, I'll be sure to highlight those. So he starts off this third chapter on the giants, speculating, because of the fact that Genesis 5:3 says that Seth was generated by Adam, quote, with his image and resemblance, and using very similar language to the language used from the Hebrew that we covered from the early chapters of Genesis that detail the creation of Adam by the Elohim. He speculates, although he acknowledges that the text does not explicitly specify it, that perhaps Seth had also been obtained through an extraordinary operation of genetic engineering. Now, of course, Genesis 4 states that Adam knew his wife Eve and they begot Seth. But who knows? That could have been edited or added later, or you never know. It could be that originally Seth was also the product of a more direct genetic operation. And the reason he brings this up is because of the great longevity of the early patriarchs. Adam lived to be 930 years. Methuselah lived to be nearly 1,000 years. And so he's suggesting that perhaps those who were more directly produced by this genetic engineering would have naturally lived longer. And that it would make more sense then, given the genealogy given in Genesis showing how long these first 7, 8, 9, 10 patriarchs lived, it would make sense to think that Seth might have come about through this more extraordinary type of procedure or operation, rather than having been born through sexual procreation by Adam and Eve. He also wants to bring up the fact that members of the traditional monotheistic religions have always been divided and very uncomfortable, divided on the subject of the Nephilim from Genesis 6, and many of them extremely uncomfortable admitting that these beings were having sexual relations with human women. Because if we argue that they are immortal angels, if we're operating under the assumption that these angelic beings, if we're operating under the assumption that angels, as taught in the later theological traditions, were the ones who were producing giants, you have to explain how in the world these more ethereal, sort of phantasmal, immortal entities are brandishing genitalia and reproducing like humans, which causes a lot of theologians and scholars to sort of back away from that concept and suggest that the men of renown, the heroes, so to speak, in Genesis 6 were not literally giants in terms of their physical stature, but in terms of their deeds, and that they were also kings and rulers and great warriors. So he's going to get into that here and explain why that doesn't work. So he's saying, of course, as we get closer to the flood account, it was originally the original story, which was again changed later by the later Hebrew authors of Genesis and redactors of Genesis. But the original story has plural Elohim, plural gods, discussing the problem of mankind's procreation and their getting kind of out of hand. There being too many of them. They don't want too many of them running around, right? Because they're harder to control, harder to manage. And in the Sumerian text, they're discussing this problem, deciding how to shorten Adam's age. And so that kind of explains, he says, God in the Hebrew account warning that, with the flood, a man's lifespan will be shortened to 120 years. But anyway, let's go ahead and start with Genesis 6. So he gets into the text, Genesis 6, 1 through 8, and he says that it is said that Adam, the earthly, started breeding on the earth's surface, and that, of course, also had some daughters. Most of the Anunnaki who had landed on this planet to work were likely to be males, while the females of that species were scarce. It is not difficult to imagine that the natural needs, and maybe even the desire to give a new stability to their life, which was now entirely spent on this planet, Earth, should have aroused the attention of these individuals towards the new female, human female creatures. I think that's a very interesting. I want to stop there and kind of comment on that, because I have long wondered, in light of the mythos behind Genesis 6 and the fallen angels and the giants and the commingling of the fallen angels and the women, why it is that so much of the world had, and even ancient Israel, but that's a different topic. Many scholars have written on this, that in ancient Israel, Yahweh had a consort, Asherah, and Yahweh was always worshipped with his consort. And then, of course, that would suggest that the later redactors and editors sort of edited Asherah out of the texts. And of course, a good Jew then would worship Yahweh alone. And then, of course, the northern Israel is portrayed as being blasphemous and idolatrous and evil and wicked because they worship Asherah along with Yahweh. But over time, the Jewish people evolve in their theology to become more and more patriarchal, to the point of excising the goddess from their psyche altogether, and then from their worship and their theology. And I often wondered, well, why do so many nations around the world, why are they worshiping gods and goddesses? Why are they worshiping a god and his consort? But Israel is not doing that. The Jews are not doing that. Well, they did actually at one time. And then the winners, the ones who sort of took control of the narrative, isolated the opposition as being not true Jews, when in fact the worship of God and his consort was the earliest practice of the ancient Israelites and of the Canaanites. And in fact, the ancient Israelites were Canaanites. Those early Semitic groups all came out of Canaan. But I speculate here that, you know, this excitement that that the Anunnaki, or whoever these fallen angels were, right, or fallen beings were, the Elohim, why do they get so excited about our women when they had their own women? Where it would stand to reason that there was a scarcity of females. This could partly indicate why the Jews didn't, I don't know, I'm just speculating here, why their angels are all take on masculine features and male names, you know, like Gabriel, Uriel, Raphael, and so on. Michael, because there was already a scarcity of female Elohim. Almost all of their initial contact and interaction with, intercourse with these beings was with the males. And and then, of course, the nations were allotted to the sons, the male progeny of El. So you could kind of see from that standpoint how maybe certain patriarchal societies would have developed from that, where the goddess gets excised from the consciousness, so to speak, because of the prominence of the male Elohim and the lack of real emphasis on the females. So anyway, he gets into Genesis 6 verse 2. He produces the Hebrew, and then he translates it. The Elohim's sons saw that Adam's daughters were beautiful, good in parentheses, and amidst all they took for them the women they chose. So I'm going to read what he has to say here, because he lingers on an important point. We point out, he says, that the term tavot, T-O-V-O-T, is usually translated as beautiful, but it also means capable or suitable. The opposite is used, for example, in the common saying, good for nothing, meaning incompetent or unfit. Well, these women clearly appeared good, that is, appropriate to establish relationships, the setting of families. In other words, suitable for practicing sexual intercourse and subsequent reproduction. Then the text continues by telling the anger and the sorrow of God, who, seeing this barbarity, decides to erase humanity from the earth's face. And he quotes scripture on that. We all know that text. I'm going to skip down. At this point, the Genesis editor interrupts the narration's main flow to include a kind of annotation, a sort of time contextualization, almost a reminder for those who were aware of the events, and with a very colloquial expression. So then he renders verse 4 of Genesis 6 in the Hebrew and translates it thusly. The Nephilims were on earth in those days, and even so, after that, the Elohim's children had entered the Adam's daughters and had given birth to their, in brackets, Elohim's, strong, brackets, sons, and in parentheses, valiant, heroes, that since ever, in brackets, were men of name, parentheses, famous. He comments that the text presents a lack of clarity with which the editor describes this passage. Basically, there is no absolute certainty as to whether the Nephilim were the product of these unions, or they existed independently. So in other words, did the giants not come about until these Anunnaki began to mate with human women? So you could have had the patriarchs, the early patriarchs, living an extraordinary long period of time due to receiving the DNA through genetic engineering from the Anunnaki, but perhaps they were of a more standard stature, because they were also created through a mix of DNA from earthly primates, whereas maybe the giants did not come along until around the time of the flood, when this other group of Anunnaki decided they wanted to seize human women and cohabit with them. He says that the text isn't clear. I personally believe that the giants did not come about until this particular specific group around the time of the flood began cohabiting with women. But he goes on to say, he goes on to mention that the Book of Jubilees, which I've read a couple of times, belonging to the extra-biblical Jewish literature, expressly says in 5:1 that the Nephilim were the children of these unions. So that would corroborate what my sense is. And he also reminds us that the first century author Titus Flavius Josephus, speaks in his book of the Jewish Antiquities that the angels of God met with earthly women and wicked children were born. So he takes a more literal approach as well. Now what Bellino does is he breaks down the Hebrew word Nephilim and explains something very important here, because most people think it simply means giants, but he suggests it means more than that. So traditionally, this term is translated as giants, as in the Greek version of the 70, the Septuagint, which expressly refers to gigantes. However, the Hebrew root of the verb nephal, hence the term Nephilim, means to fall, to come down, to descend, or also by extension, decay. Thus, the quoted verse should be more correctly translated with the following meaning. Quote, "At that time on earth, there were those who had fallen or descended." In these terms, the problem of interpretation would disappear, because as it is not about giants, it would neither be necessary to determine their origins nor whether they were the product of the new unions. So very simply, the Bible tells us that in those days, those who descended from heaven still lived on earth. Another possible interpretation might suggest that these beings who had come from the sky made improper matches, producing a bastardization of the original purity, which is what I kind of tend to think. In this case, it would be about decayed individuals. In the words of the aforementioned Ethiopian Book of Enoch, quote, "bastardized beings," quote unquote, that's a quote, "contaminated by these improper unions," quote, "corrupted, perverse, unclean, addicted to fornication, wicked, prostitutes, children," end quote. And even in modern times, we speak of fallen or decayed nobility, but the issue widens because the concept of giants is found in other passages of the Bible, where they are described with other names. So I'm going to stop it right here and do a part 5, chapter 2. This is going to be part 5, chapter 1. And he's going to get into some other texts where he discusses these different strands of Nephilim called the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the Emim. There are others as well. The Zamzumim is another one. So we're going to get into those in the next one.